AIA in a Day, Healthcare Accessibility with Bill Zelmer from Sutter Health. My name is Teresa Endres. I'm the chair of the Central Valley AIA Academy of Architecture for Health. Today we have 95 registered for this course, which is a great turnout for a 5-hour seminar. I'd like to recognize all of the, can we go to the next slide? So I can recognize all of, yes, I'd like to recognize all of the Central Valley AIA sustaining partners. This elite group supports the activities of the AIA Central Valley throughout the year. Next slide, please. The chapter has several upcoming events. Oh, this is me. These are our events for our committee. We have other events coming up that are all virtual. We have Mentor Meetup on Wednesday, August 12th from 5 to 6:30 p.m. and that will be via Zoom. We have our Academy of Architecture for Health committee meeting, which is Tuesday the 18th from noon to 1. And within that, we always have a what we call the OshPod Share, where OshPod takes the first half of the meeting, usually around half an hour, to share a topic. And then we have the Design Narrative Presents Home Study Residential Design, which is on Wednesday, August 19th from 12 to 1:30. We have Let's Talk County of Sacramento, which will be Tuesday, August 25th from 12 to 1. And then we have Transforming How We Build series, Meeting Climate Change Goals with Fast OX Gasification. And that is on Thursday, August 20th from 11:30 to 1 p.m. For all of those events, you can go to the Central Valley AIA website, which is aiacv.org. The chapter is also launching a new website this weekend, so please visit the new website on Monday to get information on these events and register. Now I'd like to introduce Bill Zelmer and Bill Whipple from Sutter Health.
Okay. Okay, so you can hear me. Are we going to switch off at this point so I share screen?
Yes, and
Okay.
If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box button, and I will be kind of pulling those together, and similar questions will get rolled into one question. We'll stop periodically for Bill to answer questions.
So I go to share screen, but it says I can't share screen.
Oh, Teen will stop sharing her screen.
There we go. All right. So I think we're ready. Everybody can see my screen okay? Thumbs up. All right.
Yes.
So let's get started. So let me introduce myself. I did want to throw in just a little COVID funny haha. This is unusual times. So there we go. So we're going to try to have a little bit of fun today, as much fun as you can, while doing 5 hours of building code discussion in ADA compliance. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Bill Zelmer. I'm an architect and certified access specialist. I've got my bio up on screen here, but what's not shown up on screen, so I started my architectural career back in 1979 out of a small architectural office in Placerville, Ed Murray. While I was going to college at Cal Poly, I went back and forth during the summers. It was a great way to start off in the profession. Worked at a few small offices in the Sacramento area. And then in 1995, started at OshPod, and that's kind of where my healthcare career began. So at OshPod, I was a rank and file plan checker, worked in the North region, the coastal region, and the South region. And at that point, transferred laterally at OshPod to what was then called the Regulations Unit. Now it's called the Building Standards Unit. So I had the privilege, pointedly, of helping write OshPod's first interpretations for accessibility as it relates to healthcare. That's their Code Application Notice 2-11B. We'll go over that a little later in the morning. Left Oshpod in 2009 and went to work at Stafford King Weese Architects. The important point here, I worked on barrier removal work on a whole series of Kaiser projects. So the interesting thing there, that was the result of a class action lawsuit, which brought me deep, deep into the world of accessibility and all the fine little details. Went to work for Vanner Construction Management in 2012, and yet another lawsuit, a class action lawsuit against the state of California. Interestingly, the California Department of Corrections was sued for lack of ADA compliance. So our project for pretty much a whole year was going in and out of our state prisons and doing the accessibility survey work. We went with a group of 10 of us, one at a time, and strange, but interesting stuff. Everywhere that a prison inmate goes in the prison, we had to go survey that. So that included the exercise yard, the cells, the conjugal visit area. It included, strangely, actually surveying death row. Out of all the weird things, I actually ended up having a conversation literally with Charles Manson about the ADA. So strange day. In any case, left Vanner. I had started doing survey work for Sutter Health at that point, and eventually Sutter hired me on staff. It's a super good fit for me. My Oshpod experience, the ADA compliance stuff has all come together. Great fit for me. So what's going on here at Sutter? We also were sued for lack of ADA compliance, a class action lawsuit. So in response to that, we have a whole program cranked up. We've been spending, the last 12 years now, changing out all of our buildings, removing 187,000 barriers. So that's 187,000 fixes over all 24 of our hospitals and several hundred medical office buildings. So the important piece on that I want to relay to you, the center of my universe on this has been a monthly conference call that I have with all the consultants that we have working for us. So we have some of the best and the brightest in the country as our consultants. We're very privileged to have ETA, Evan Terry Associates from Birmingham, Alabama. We work with Jim Terry, with Kaylin Dunlap, with Dan Woosley, with Walter Level, and the whole gang over there as our consultants. These guys are nationally known. If you look at their list of projects and accessibility, it's something to behold. They're working on the US Capitol, boy, it's a long list. These guys are the best at what they do. Then here in California, we have consultants from San Diego. We've got Karina Wilkes. We have Katie Scheel. We've got from San Luis Obispo, Eric McSwain and Jeff Foster. And in Sacramento, we have Brian McCusker and Amy Casado. So the point in all of that is we get all of us together on a call once a month, and we talk about all those strange, weird, gray areas about accessibility, specifically in healthcare. So what I'm going to present to you today is not just my thoughts, it's the cumulative knowledge of a whole bunch of very smart people. So I'm going to move on. Enough about me. Trying to make this a little more conversational today, I brought in one of my associates, Bill Whipple. So we've got the Bill and Bill show going here today. So Bill, I want to hand it off to you to introduce yourself.
So I've, like Bill, have been working in healthcare since easily in '96, maybe a little before, mostly in the planning and design of healthcare facilities, focused on clinical workflows and how that applies to the built environment. Really looking to apply what would be standard operating procedures in the healthcare setting or where those need to be improved, and developing the design solutions around that. So today, like in what Bill and I do on a daily basis, I'm hoping to ask some of the tough questions that many of our healthcare clients would be asking, our administrators, our clinicians, physicians, in the design of some of these spaces. My resume, pretty much on screen here, with the background at different healthcare design firms as well as with Sutter Health. I'm oftentimes at the front line, having to educate folks as to why we need to do ADA upgrades, clinical partners. And so even to the point where whenever I meet a new resident, I find myself taking the time right away to explain how every project's going to have an ADA toilet upgrade so they get used to it. But that's just a little sidebar there. I'll be, through the course of the conversation, looking at the chat and looking at the questions that you're asking, filtering through them. If there aren't any, I probably will be asking some tough ones of Bill. What we normally do in our daily routine is I actually will challenge Bill as a design professional, and then Bill plays the role of an OSHPD plan checker, and we work through the arguments. And oftentimes, we as design professionals, we might think that we have a very solid argument, and I find after a few minutes working with Bill that maybe it's not the right approach, the argument that's sometimes taken. I think the material we'll go through today will sort of expose maybe some of the better approaches to how to mitigate some of the challenges we face in applying ADA to the healthcare setting. So I want to thank the AIA for the opportunity to present this today. This is fantastic. And being able to do it with Bill, who's such an incredible resource to the profession. And a little bit of tidbit that Bill didn't expose is that he was a disc jockey. And later we'll see if he'll maybe tell us where he was a disc jockey in his early years. So thanks, Bill.
Yeah, KCPR San Luis Obispo while I was at Cal Poly. Not a very good radio voice, but I like music, so there you go. So I'm gonna stop video so you guys don't see my face through all this. I can do without that. So when I do that, we're gonna go ahead and move on and get started. So this is an AIA course. You do get continuing education credit for the course. The outline of what we're going to cover this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about accessibility in healthcare. Then I'm going to show a couple of videos. We'll see if we can make the technology work for us. We'll talk a little bit about the building code versus the ADA dueling codes. And then we'll spend most of the rest of the morning on scoping, healthcare specific. We'll talk about the path of travel in all its glory. Got a couple of case studies we'll share with you on path of travel. We'll probably spend a lot of time with Q&A on that. That's a big part of what we do. I'll talk about the toilet area time bomb, and then we'll take a break. Then we'll come back after the break, talk about employee workstations, finish out healthcare scoping with some miscellaneous issues, talk about toilet rooms, and then the OSHPD CAN 2-11B. We'll take a break for lunch at 11:30 to 12:30. And after lunch, we'll pick up the technical sections of 11B 805, take another break. Then we'll cover medical room types, and I think you'll really get a lot of mileage out of this. This is where we're going to put on screen a floor plan of an exam room, a floor plan of a treatment room, floor plan of a mammography room, et cetera, and talk through the various requirements from an accessibility standpoint. We'll take a quick break after that, do a little bit of a game show to lighten it up a little. And then what I think is probably the most interesting part of the day, which is saving the best for last, we're going to cover some special issues, which is doors and forced to open, big issue. Hospital tub and shower rooms, bedpan washers, privacy curtains, eye wash facilities, and then finally, detectable warnings. And we should be out the door at about 3 o'clock. So let me get started. And let me check in with our Bill. Do we have Bill Whipple? Do we have any questions at this point before we charge into everything?
No questions at this point. For everybody, you can see that Tinley has posted again the call-in if you want to use that call-in number.
Okay, so I wanted to take just a few minutes and put this into the proper context. Accessibility in healthcare. It is different than accessibility if you're working on a restaurant or an office building or any other type of building. So a couple of points I wanted to make. Most of you that have done healthcare work with OSHPD are probably very familiar with the fact that OSHPD has in the California Building Code some increased requirements in the California Building Code that don't exist in the ADA standards. It's above and beyond that. Secondly, there's a national healthcare focus as a kind of a subcategory of the ADA. What I've been doing for the past 6 years now is going to the National ADA Symposium, and great organization, a lot to be said for that. Point here, they've got a track specifically for healthcare. So in fact, Sutter Health, I've participated in giving some sessions in that healthcare track, but for reasons I'm not entirely clear on, there is a specific healthcare track to this, and that points up the uniqueness of accessibility in healthcare. Now, as part of that, then the US Access Board has developed the AME standards. They're accessible medical equipment standards. It's not been adopted by the Department of Justice at this point, but the standards are out there, and more or less, the way I like to describe this, you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the transfer requirements from a wheelchair to a toilet or from a wheelchair to a bench, and it's really important that the height is regulated. Well, that's kind of what they're doing here with the AME standards. There's specific requirements that if you're going to provide an accessible exam table and you're going to call it an accessible piece of medical equipment, they regulate the height that you would set that at and any grab bar requirements and so forth. So that document is out there and that's useful, although it's not actually adopted by the Department of Justice. And then there is understanding in our healthcare arena, wheelchair transfers. So the point I want to make here, what is unique in what we do with healthcare that you don't do in a restaurant, you don't do it in a school. In our world, the patients, our clients, actually transfer from their wheelchair to something else, to the exam table, to the treatment table, and so forth. So that's kind of a big deal, as you all, I'm sure, can appreciate. As an adult, if you're getting yourself out of your chair with only your arm strength and you transfer laterally to some other thing, if you were to slip and fall, it can be a big deal. You could hit your head. So the requirements about this are something that I think is really important for us to talk about. First, to put this in the right context, we'll have plenty of time to go over the code requirements. But what I want to share with you now is a couple of videos that make the point on the transfer. So I'm going to narrate this myself. So I'm going to turn the volume down and just kind of give you a flavor of how this transfer occurs. So what you're seeing on screen there is what's commonly referred to as a Hoyer lift. It's a device that helps transfer the patient from their wheelchair to either a bed or an exam table through the use of a sling that is strapped up to this device. So I'm going to fast forward through this. I won't drag you through the whole video, but I think you'll get the picture here that what goes on is the patient is lifted up and out of their wheelchair and then rolled over to the bed or exam table in our case. The point I want to make is consider the amount of space that you need for this to occur. Now, in the healthcare world, we're all trying very hard to keep our healthcare facilities tightly designed and as small as possible so that we can limit the cost of healthcare in the interest of everybody. But the space that you need to make this happen is considerable. So we'll go through all the code requirements of this. I'm going to back up. I think that's as far as we need to show that video. Then there's a second video, which is a different type of transfer, very similar. So this is when you have the overhead lift in a hospital or other medical facility. And it's more or less the same kind of thing. You're putting a sling under the patient and then strapping it up to this overhead lift so that you can move them in and out of the bed. So I'm just going to kind of skip forward in the video to make the point. This is another way that you do the transfer. And I got to say at this point, there's a bit of crossover. People with disabilities, in particular mobility disabilities, there's a large crossover in commonality between a patient who has a medical condition. It's for our purposes more or less the same thing. So I'm going to move on from that to a third video with shows kind of a slightly different thing. So this is if you have a patient who's able to briefly stand. So it's showing how we're going to have a little ad. This happens when you use YouTube. So, and I don't want the 1 month free trial. So when you've got a patient that can briefly stand, you set up with a medical provider that helps them stand up briefly and pivot as they move from their wheelchair to the bed. This video is taken from a educational program for CNA state board exam skills. So more or less they strap up the patient and through leverage and careful positioning, help the patient stand up and then pivot and then sit down on the bed. So I'll pause here and let you watch the video. So that is something I simply want you all to keep in mind as we go through all of our code discussion today. This is what it's all about. Now, one last video, a slightly different thing. This is a patient that has ALS. So there's a communication issue. I'm going to try to put the volume up so you can hear this. There is going to be closed captioning. So let me know if this sound does not come through.
When she had that experience with the mammography and I came home and she told me about it, she was upset, and it sounded like an awful experience and not one that anyone would want to have. And that isn't the first time that sort of thing has happened. It was particularly bad. So they kept trying to force me into positions that I couldn't quite hold, and I kept having to repeat the picture and move behind me.
If you talk with anyone who has disability, whether it's physical or cognitive or mental health, given enough time, you'll hear these kinds of stories. This is not an uncommon problem. It results in healthcare disparities, which are quite significant.
If people are going to live good, quality, successful lives in the community, even people with very complex disabilities, we're going to need to change how we deliver health care.
Hey, crispy. Try. Where do you want it? Okay. So I also have CP. Our disabilities are kind of opposite. Like you want to be on the ground, and I have trouble getting down to ground level sometimes. And I want to be up high, yeah.
How are things going?
Pretty good.
Pretty good? Yeah? I'm gonna check your blood pressure first, and you can tell me what brings you in today, okay?
My current doctor, she's pretty good. She did a lot of time and listens to me and answers all my questions. But I haven't answered my rest for it.
So let me try starting with the spine. Any pain there? Okay.
I feel comfortable enough to correct her assumptions. I think she had enough patience and care to be okay along together. I am super good to it. We have 16 hours a day, all the time. I am physically active. I come in, I do yoga, I clean the stairs.
How many hours are you in the chair during the day?
I'm not really fit of it. I get out and call around at home.
Okay. I would say that it's a learning process. I did make an assumption that Melissa was basically in her chair all day. And a couple of visits ago, she actually told me, no, I'm not. And I was surprised. And so it's not like I have her walking around in the room or, getting outside of the chair. And so for me, that was a learning moment. It was like, oh, next time I should ask the question, in terms of how you spend your day, how much of it is in the chair versus ambulating. So part of it is just letting go of assumptions and finding out what's really going on.
Okay, folks, so I'm going to stop there and go back to the PowerPoint. I simply wanted to set the tone of what we're going to talk about today. And there's a special empathy that I think we need to have as we work through all of those code issues. We can get lost in the code discussion and lose sight of the fact that this is about real people. And by the way, they're not all the same. The disabilities are all different. So with that in mind, I'm going to move forward. What do you want to check in with Mr. Bill Whipple? Do we have anything that's come up at this point in terms of questions?
So our
Any
first
comment?
question, are AME standards aimed at accessibility for the provider or for the patient or both? That's a great question.
They're targeted towards the patient. The AME standards are all about the patient's access. Any follow-up, any other questions?
No, not so far. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, sure. All right, so now I want to take a few moments and just kind of lay out the dueling codes. I'm sure you're all familiar with the California Building Code. I know we do have some people attending from out of state, so they all are more familiar probably with the ADA standards. It's worth taking a few moments and just kind of going through this. So the California Building Code comes into different iterations. It's changed every 3 years. And in fact, there's an interim code cycle between each of those. So the building code changes really every year and a half. Separate from that is the ADA standards. We're held accountable to both of these standards all the time. Now, they are significantly overlapping. What we'll be doing today is talking entirely about the California Building Code. And the reason for that is that state law in California requires that the California Building Code meets or exceeds each of the ADA standards. Now, it's true that once in a great while, we do find, oh golly, turns out the ADA standard has the higher standard for one particular thing here or there. But for practical purposes, for doing a seminar, it's really not worth getting into that level of granularity. So we're just going to talk about the California Building Code today. Now, when we've found, from my experience, when I end up going to do research on the ADA standards, that tends to be strictly relative to lawsuit-driven stuff. And because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to go any deeper into it than that, because I'll be a little bit out of my arena. So with that understanding, I want to go a little deeper then into the building code. So you're probably all familiar with this, but for a little bit of a refresher, the building code is part 2 of the California Code of Regulations. And where we are in accessibility is chapter 11B, the commercial facilities requirements. So for the rest of the day, we'll be talking about chapter 11B stuff in the California Building Code. Now inside of 11B, we've got the 10 divisions of 11B. Division 2 is huge. This is scoping, and we'll spend most of the morning talking about scoping. So that's all about how many, how much, and the distribution. This should be a refresher for you all. You probably have run into this before. The divisions 3 through 10 are all of the technical requirements. So what you'll do is you'll look up, say, how many telephones need to meet accessibility requirements in Division 2. Then you'll go to Division 7 to look up the specific telephone requirements. Same for toilets, same for everything. Now, our healthcare stuff is down in Division 8, 11B 805. We'll cover that in detail in our afternoon session. So scoping, I'm going to break this down into 5 or 6 separate discussions. The first is the 11B 223. It's sort of the generic scoping standards. So this breaks down what I have on screen. I know it's too small for you all to read, and I don't intend for you to read it. It breaks down into 4 subsections. It's the point 1 section, which is general. It's really about hospitals, and the SNF is skilled nursing facility. So it's hospital and SNFs with a concentration on alterations. The second section is about hospitals. The third is skilled nursing, and the fourth is medical offices. So I'm going to go through each one of these. First is the sub 1 section on general. So as I said earlier, this is all about hospital and skilled nursing alterations. The language of this starts off discussing licensed 24-hour facilities. Pointedly, there is a specific exemption for critical care and intensive care, or ICU rooms. So just so that you know, the ICU rooms right there in the exception are given an exemption from the 11B 603, which is the toilet room accessibility requirements. Now, it's important to know, and we don't get this argument too much anymore, but early on when these code sections were new, when DSA unrolled the new formatting back in the 2013 code cycle, there was a lot of debate about whether these requirements applied to medical office buildings, and they do. Long story short, the subsections that follow, the point 2, point 3, and point 4 sections, they're independent of this one. What some people were doing is reading this first sentence and saying, oh, it says right here, licensed 24-hour care. Well, my medical office building is not one of those, so everything else that follows doesn't apply to us. It does apply. It's independent of this first section. So I'm going to move on, but let me pause. Bill, do we have any questions yet? I've kind of covered a little bit of ground there.
Not so far. Looks good.
Okay, thanks. I think I've covered that. Let's move on to the next. So then there's an awful lot of text. This is the point 1, and point 1.2 subsections. So I'm the kind of guy that likes to simplify stuff. So I've kind of simplified this all about alterations by saying these 2 paragraphs deal more or less with big projects and small projects. Now, being that most all of you are architects, I'm going to cut to the floor plans, which I think you gravitate to inherently. So let me explain it this way. What those 2 paragraphs are saying is if you're remodeling a hospital or skilled nursing, the big project version of that might be you're remodeling a whole wing of a hospital. And if you're doing that, say for the sake of our example, you have 20 patient bedrooms. There's a scoping requirement, which strangely happens in the next subsection. That standard is 10%. So you would go to the 20 rooms, do the math, 10% of 20 rooms is 2. So your obligation on this project is to provide 2 accessible patient bedrooms. Pointedly, you're not being held responsible for the whole darn building. You're just responsible for this geographic area, this particular unit or this wing. That's what the first paragraph is saying. Now, the second paragraph is saying if you've got a smallish project, you still apply that 10% standard, but the math is, in my case, not intuitive, at least not to me. What they do is they hold you accountable to the same geographic area, the unit. So in our case, say it's this wing of the hospital, we're only remodeling 4 rooms, but our obligation is to do whatever we can in our little 4-room project to bring that unit up to the required 10%. So we end up having to make 2 out of those 4 rooms accessible. It happens to be 50% of our project, but it's only 10% of that room or that wing. So hopefully that makes sense. Bill, is that clear as mud to you? Is this making sense?
That's clear. Let me
Okay.
ask a question, Bill. So sometimes we have providers that still build out sleep rooms, and say on this patient floor, they wanted to add a sleep room. And using these 2 examples, there's no sleep room currently in the hospital that's ADA compliant. So how might that get resolved?
So a doctor's sleep room is a special case. And I remember, in fact, when I was at Oshpod, we were struggling with this one. It doesn't really fit in any particular category. I remember we talked about, does it feel more like a hotel room? Should we apply the hotel standards? It is a debatable thing. I would not apply the 10% standard. That seems a little excessive. I believe that the appropriate scoping would either be 100% or which is all of them. In fact, or you could argue in applying a percentage of rooms that would be borrowed from the standards that apply to hotels and motels. So you end up not having necessarily all of your doctor's sleep rooms being accessible. Does that answer your question?
Yep, it does.
Okay, I'm
And
gonna
then
move.
we do have
Oh, yeah, go
a
ahead.
question came up.
Yeah.
It says, does this apply to patient rooms or patient beds? So they're distinguishing rooms versus beds.
Very, very good.
Yeah.
So I'm going to cover that actually in 2 more slides, but the short answer is it's patient bedrooms, not beds. The industry, we all talk about having a 300-bed hospital or a 60-bed addition to a hospital, but this number crunching is done on the basis of patient bedrooms. Little different nuance. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. The next slide, the point 2 section. So this is specifically about hospitals. So this is the section that says the scoping percentage for patient bedrooms is 10%. Now, there is a nuance. If you are dealing with facilities that specialize in treating conditions that affect mobility, then the scoping percentage is 100%. Now, there is a bit of debate of what that is, and the Department of Justice has stepped in and developed a guidance for that. Now, I want to go over then the basic concepts. What we have is 10% of the patient bedrooms must be accessible. The number crunching is done on the basis of patient bedrooms, not beds. So here's another nuance. Accessible is sort of a shorthand that we use. What it technically reads is mobility features. So when we say, sort of in a shorthand, you have to have 10% of the patient bedrooms accessible, really, we're required to make 10% of the patient bedrooms comply with mobility features that are in section 11B 805. The point being, all of the other accessibility stuff you have to do in all the rooms. Now, to explain this in more detail, if you have protruding objects, you're not allowed to say, well, in the 90% of the rooms that are not accessible, I'm allowed to have protruding objects. And I don't have to put Braille on the room numbers on 90% of the rooms. Obviously, you don't do it that way. Next point that I want to make, as I said earlier, 100% of patient bedrooms must be accessible for facilities that specialize in treating conditions that affect mobility. That's a mouthful. And then the next slide is the Department of Justice advisory. So what those are, this is word for word out of the DOJ advisory. So what those are is conditions that require the use of or assistance of a brace, cane, crutch, prosthetic device, wheelchair, or powered mobility aid, arthritic, neurological, or orthopedic conditions that severely limit one's ability to walk, respiratory diseases, cardiac conditions, and so forth. Now, if you have any questions on that, smart thing to do would be to chat with OSHPD about that, or possibly even talk to the Department of Justice for clarification, because that could have a profound effect. Now, I will say this, in my experience, I only remember this being applied in rehab units. That's where it is most common. So for example, our Sutter Roseville Hospital has a separate rehab unit, and the whole unit, all 100% of the patient bedrooms, all have to meet the mobility requirements. So let me pause there before I move on. Mr. Bill Whipple, do we have any other questions?
We do. And I'd like to, so the question is, how about if there's one exam room being remodeled? But Bill, let's see if we can answer this in two settings. There are exam rooms in hospitals and there are exam rooms in the outpatient setting. And then those exam rooms, either of those settings could be in a higher percentage environment that you just described or a lower. So if you're remodeling one exam room in a hospital, to what degree would it need to be accessible?
So that's a good question. And this is, strangely, the scoping section doesn't really directly address that. So the answer is 100%. And we'll cover that further in the afternoon session that talks specifically about exam rooms. But what you'll find is these sections that we're talking about are silent about exam and treatment rooms. So to answer your question, it is 100%. So if you're remodeling one exam room, you have to make that one exam room accessible. If you're remodeling 7 exam rooms and 3 treatment rooms, you have to make all of them accessible, or to meet the mobility requirements for accessibility in all of them. That applies both in a hospital and in a ambulatory care setting, a medical office building, or a clinic. And I don't know that everybody knows that, especially at city and county building departments. They may or may not get that nuance. Does that answer the question?
It does. Thank you, Bill.
Okay. Anything else? Does this bring up anything else for you that comes to mind?
No, not at this time.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on then. So now long-term care facilities, so this is skilled nursing, SNFs. The scoping percentage is simply 50%, and everything else is just as we talked about for hospitals. So I don't think we need to go into much more detail on that. And then the 0.4 section in scoping, this is where we talk about the professional offices of healthcare providers. And again, this was hotly debated back in the 2013 code cycle, because this is the code section right here, just the one sentence, but this is where it says professional offices of healthcare providers. That would be a medical office building. They shall comply with 11B 805, which is to say they must be accessible. Now, I don't think that's as hot a debate as it once was, but I've shown on screen here, there is a definition in the building code for the professional office of a healthcare provider. And more or less, the way I like to describe this is if I had to stand in front of a judge and explain how I don't think we have to meet these requirements, I would be hard pressed to explain how we have doctors and nurses and medical staff that provide medical treatment and care, and yet we don't consider ourselves to be the professional office of a healthcare provider. We would lose, obviously. So those do fall under these requirements, and that's not necessarily what everybody understands. So I'm going to leave it at that and move on unless there's any other questions.
Bill, I have a quick question. So if I'm somebody that provides sort of psychiatric treatment in my own office as a provider, would that office then need to be fully ADA compliant, fully accessible?
Yes, it would. You may have noticed on this previous slide, I've underlined, it says physical or mental health. Now, fortunately or otherwise, in the context of a mental health care provider in an outpatient setting, there really isn't much in the technical code sections of 805, which we'll talk about in the afternoon, that you would end up triggering. So if you go into a mental health care outpatient setting, people sit in chairs, they sit at tables, you may have conferences. You don't have healthcare exam tables and such for the most part. So there's really nothing that it actually affects. Any follow-up, Bill?
So I think that you're making it clear that both the exam room and where you might receive consult need to both be ADA or accessible.
Yeah, okay. So now I want to get into, oh, you guys are going to love this, the infamous alterations path of travel. So those of you that do healthcare work, which should be just about all of you, you know how big of an issue this is. This is going to have 100 different looks to it. No two remodel projects are quite the same. So you've probably seen this code section over and over and over again. We're going to break it down and talk about it in quite a bit of detail. I'm going to show a couple of case studies to lay it all out for you. So it's worth noting that at OshPod, something in the range of 90% of all OshPod projects are indeed remodel projects. So the text is on screen there. When alterations or additions are made to existing buildings or facilities, an accessible path of travel to the specific area of alteration shall be provided. And then it lists these 5 elements of the path of travel that you shall make accessible. Now, the first thing I like to hone in on here is the word to. The implication is you go from here to there. Where are we starting? What is the starting point? The code, to my great unhappiness, is not as clearly and well written as I would like it to have been. So let's break this down. What to refers to then is where are the people coming from? So in our understanding, responsibility for our property starts at our property line. So as we analyze this, if the guests are arriving by car, then the starting point is the parking stalls. Now, if you go back and you look at the language, I'm going to back up here. There's nothing on this slide that says anything about parking. And when you get deep into these code issues, I know that's annoying to a lot of people. We end up spending a lot of time on parking, and yet nothing here talks about parking. This is more or less the result of understanding how this works. So if their starting point is the parking stall, that's where you start. If the guests arrive from down the street, then your starting point is the public way, the sidewalk. Third, if they're being dropped off, a taxi, bus, or an Uber, then your starting point is the passenger loading zone. So we've actually got 3 points from which we should be tracing our path of travel. And I think most people, most of the time, are only showing the path of travel to the parking stall. That's really not entirely right. Now, does the code really say that? Well, in a roundabout way, it does. It's not as direct as we would like. There is a definition in the building code for path of travel, and it does specifically reference parking areas. It's a little bit oblique, but that's the world that we live in. This is what your building official is likely to point to and says, right here is where it defines path of travel, and that does include the parking areas. So yes, you have to do it. So when we do our projects, we want to trace the path of travel from those 3 starting points. Now, separate from that is the whole toilet room discussion, a very big issue in healthcare. So starting off in the scoping section of 213 for toilet and bathing facilities, this is where it tells us this is how many toilet rooms we need to make accessible. This part of it says where we have separate toilet facilities for different user groups, then you have to provide accessible toilet rooms for the different user groups. So your garden variety version of that is in a healthcare facility where we have separate toilet rooms for staff, visitors, and patients, which is required by the plumbing code. So you'll note on these 2 code sections out of the plumbing code, they specifically say you have to have separate toilet facilities for each gender or each sex, and then separate toilet facilities for patients, staff, and visitors. So the bottom line on this is that when you do a remodel project in a healthcare facility, you may very well be, and it happens all the time, you're triggering a current code ADA upgrade for 5 different toilet rooms: the male and female public, the male and female staff, and typically a unisex patient toilet. So again, if you stumble into doing healthcare work and you don't know this, that is a big mistake. You could miss what could easily be $100,000 worth of work. So I'm going to move on. There is an exception for primary care clinics only. So this would be an OSHPD 3 facility, relatively new section of code. And if you didn't know this, this could be worth the price of attending today. So where a facility contains no more than 3 examination and/or treatment rooms, then the patient toilet shall be permitted to serve the waiting areas. That could be a big deal. It could save you the separate male and female public toilet rooms work. So I'm going to go to a case study to explain this in a way that I think everybody will connect with better. But before I do that, Bill, do we have any questions?
We do, but I think we can wait a few more minutes in the next section of your slides.
Okay, so I've got this guidance slide. This is more or less for reference later. You guys are going to get the PDF of this. The point we're making on this slide, hospitals and OSHPD 3 clinics will most of the time trigger current code compliance for 5 toilet rooms. For medical office buildings, not under OSHPD jurisdiction, not subject to OSHPD 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, it may be 5 toilet rooms, but it may not be. And that nuance is you're not required in the building code to provide separate toilet rooms for staff. So if your medical office building doesn't have any of those things, yeah, you don't have to spontaneously build them just so you comply with the ADA requirements. So I'm going to go on now at this point then to the case study. So this is a hypothetical case study taken from Sutter Davis. So the obstetrics project, if we're remodeling that area with the red rectangle around it, if that's our project scope, let's take a look at the path of travel, starting with the exterior part of it. So we're going to trace it from 3 different areas. First, we go from the public way. And I got to tell you, actually on this actual property at Sutter Davis, we did this as part of our response to our lawsuit. And that's kind of a long way to get from our hospital to the sidewalk was sort of over the hills and through the woods to grandmother's house. We had to do a lot of work to get all the way to the public way. So if your facility has not done any accessibility upgrading and you do a remodel project, it could trigger a ton of work. So having said that, that's the public way. Then separately from the passenger loading zone, that's almost always a done deal. And then third, from the accessible parking. That's our exterior obligations in a nutshell. At this point, I want to add one other piece to the accessible parking discussion. There's probably 100 different versions of what that might look like. What most of us do is identify one area of accessible parking. Again, the code language doesn't really specify exactly what that should look like. So specifically, for example, if what I've represented on the slide with the little green box, if that were 6 accessible parking stalls and you did this remodel project, do you or don't you have to bring all 6 of those stalls up to current code? Do you have to bring them up to the 2% maximum slope? Well, that's debatable. What I see done most commonly is you have to make at least one of those meet current code. So now I'm going to move to the interior piece of this, and then we'll pause for questions. So the interior part of it, and we're going to get to that bathroom thing. So on the interior, we do our accessible entrance. That's usually a done deal. It's the doors and the landing for the doors. Then we've got the accessible drinking fountains and telephones. It's represented by a little purple box on the drawing. Then we've got the toilet rooms. So here's the way that typically breaks down. You've got the accessible male and female public toilet rooms, and then you've got separately the male and female staff toilet rooms, and then finally an accessible patient toilet room. So you're triggering current code upgrades on all 5 of those yellow toilet rooms. So that is how kind of a garden variety path of travel thing works in a hospital. So I want to pause here for questions, and I'm going to go to a second example after that. So Mr. Bill Whipple, what do we have in the way of questions?
All right, so the first question is, if you're remodeling a SNF that has a physical therapy room, does the toilet room in the physical therapy room need to be updated when there's an accessible restroom outside the physical therapy room?
So this is real world stuff. This kind of thing happens all the time. So if your remodel project is the physical therapy room, and you've got an existing patient toilet that serves that particular physical therapy thing, and I've got a slide later in the morning that will address this, but let's tackle it right now. The rub here is, what if you've got an accessible toilet for the patients, but it's a little further down the hall? It's not the one that's right there at physical therapy. Is that okay? Generally, it is. However, there's some caveats. Where the medical sections of code, the 1224 sections, if those sections of code specifically require that you have patient or staff toilet rooms inside of that unit, you have to provide compliance, accessibility compliance inside of that unit also. So in the case of physical therapy, I don't think the physical therapy section of code says you have to have a toilet room that serves it specifically there inside of the physical therapy area. So that would allow you to say, well, we do have an accessible toilet for the patients. And the rule of thumb OSHPD uses is within 200 feet. So if you've got something within 200 feet, they would normally accept that. So that may generate other questions. What else have you got, Bill?
Well, I think this goes back to those words that we find often in 1224 is immediately accessible, or adjacent to. So I think we'll have to get into those applications and those questions a little bit later.
Okay, sounds good.
There are some other questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Through a few of these. So the next one is, please address situation where there are non-existing separate sex toilets for different groups on a floor.
Can you restate that? I want to make sure I understood.
Yeah. So I'll read this question one more time. Please address situation where there are not existing separate sex toilets for different groups on a floor. So using the example you have on the screen here, let's take, for example, you may not have both male and female staff toilets.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure that I understand that, but let me respond to it. The obligation is, as I've presented it, that you have to be able to. It's not a choice. You have to be able to demonstrate these 5 toilet rooms, and they have to meet current code accessibility requirements. It doesn't matter that you built it 15 years ago and it was compliant to the accessibility requirements 15 years ago. You have to bring it up specifically to current code compliance. So if you don't have any, and you don't have any within 200 feet, you will have to make it so. Hopefully that answers the question they were getting at, but I suspect there may be a nuance.
Yeah, so
that I didn't cover.
Say the staff toilets are labeled as unisex, or maybe in the public toilets labeled unisex in this example, but you would still need to provide, Bill, probably evidence that you could label them male and female. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay, I see. So we've got, it's a good segue to the next slide. Okay, so sidebar discussion, gender neutral toilet rooms. This is like a setup. This is perfect. So as you all know, I'm sure California law requires gender neutral signage for single user toilet rooms. So that opens up a whole can of worms. So starting with the plumbing code. The plumbing code has a table 4-2 that's specific to OSHPD facilities. It lays out here in the plumbing code specific obligations separately for male and female toilet rooms. You've probably run into this before. So OSHPD has no choice. They have to apply the plumbing code and these specific requirements. So as you go through, this is another part of the same table. You, as well as OSHPD, they're going to go through and say, well, it says right here, you have to provide, say near the bottom of the screen, there's a pharmacy requirement, staff toilet room, male, staff toilet room, female, and the toilets are provided at the ratio of 1 to 15. So we take that and we talk to OSHPD about it. So OSHPD, which I've done, OSHPD says, plumbing code requires one male staff plus separately 1 female staff. That equals 2 staff toilet rooms. Therefore, you will be required to have 2 accessible staff toilet rooms to serve the area of alteration. In the end, you're going to be required to put a sign on those that says gender neutral. But if the question is, can I make one of them accessible and one of them not accessible, generally the answer is no. Now I want to go back to our example. So what that means on this kind of an example here, What we really are going to end up doing is taking those 2 toilet rooms on the left, and we're going to put a sign on them for gender neutral and gender neutral, both of them accessible. Now, there is a little bit of wiggle room. You could potentially argue one of 2 things. One, that, well, if I provide 50% of toilet rooms, what's the word that they use? Clustered. If you cluster toilet rooms, you're allowed to have only 50% required to be accessible. You could argue that. In this case, they happen to be right next to each other. That might succeed. Alternately, you might be able to argue if you have such a small unit that you're working with that you only have 3 employees in that unit. You might approach OSHPD and say, gee, can you cut us some slack on this? 2 toilet rooms to serve 3 people is a little excessive, and you may get traction. I can't tell you for sure which way they would go on that, though. So do you think that's getting to the issues they were asking, Mr. Whipple?
I think so. The other part of the question, let's just make sure we cover, is what if we have either public or staff toilets on a separate floor to meet the requirement in an OSHPD setting? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so in an OSHPD setting, for quite a while, the rule has been, it's not actually written in code, although I guess there's a history that goes back a lot of years. It's the 200-foot rule. So OSHPD will generally allow staff toilet rooms to be provided within 200 feet. And so when you do this exercise, you could trace your pathway to an elevator and say, I'm going 10 feet up vertically, and then another, whatever, say 50 feet to an accessible toilet room for staff. It's one of those things that OSHPD's folks may roll their eyes and say, okay, we're gonna let you get away with this because it's staff. But they generally are not okay with doing that for patients or the public. And it's kind of a case by case.
So typically no more than 1 floor up or 1 floor down.
Yes, 1 floor up or 1 floor down for staff. So there's a whole lot of variations of this. There's all kinds of different kinds of remodeling projects. I don't want this to spin out of control on what about my kind of unique remodel project. They're all a little different. This is the basics of how it would work. And as many of you have experienced, the story is a little different on every single project. So do you think we've covered this material enough to move on?
I believe so. There was a follow-on question. If staff or public toilets are single-use toilet rooms, which in California must be identified as unisex, can one of those provide facilities for each sex? And I think the answer you already covered is yes, right?
Yeah. It is a weirdness. It is undoubtedly a weirdness because, and as I've heard a lot of people describe it, folks over at DSA as well as OSHPD, the way to think about it is the very last step is putting the sign on. But you go through the steps of how many toilet rooms do I need? What's the plumbing code say? You go through all of that. You think of it as male and female separately. And then your last step is you put on a sign that says gender neutral. And that's the best that we can do for now. All of us are trying to process this, and that includes the folks at OSHPD and the local building departments in some way that makes sense.
So Bill, we have 6 questions. A few are, I think, will be pretty simple to answer.
Yeah.
One of them is, does facility mean department? So if we go back a slide or 2, you might see where those terms are being used.
Facility. It's going to be it'll be too much work to go back, but let me put it in the context of hospitals. A facility, as it relates to this, is generally viewed by OSHPD as a medical unit. So in 1224 sections of the building code, they break down a radiology unit, a surgery unit, an outpatient unit, a nursing unit, which is for your med surg beds and so on. They'll usually break it down that way, but you're always allowed to have the toilet rooms shared between this department and that department, unless code specifically says you can't, or specifically says they have to be inside of this unit, which in fact it does for surgery. The code says you have to have staff toilet rooms in the unit, and they've got this language that puts even more complexity to it. They use the immediately adjacent and so forth. You have to work your way through that to fully vet the whole accessibility piece on where am I allowed or required to provide the toilet rooms that serve the area that we're altering. That's a long way to get to the question of facility, but that's the best I can do. Is it'll break down almost always by a medical unit. So what else we got?
So a facility, in your opinion, is the medical unit. It sounds pretty consistent, Bill, to department.
Yeah. That I'm a building code guy. I don't know that they refer to departments in 1224. I'm used to the term service space. So you've got a nursing service space, a radiology service space, and so on. That's the way that OSHPD is likely to break it down and interpret all this.
And the next question, is there any movement towards bringing the code more in alignment with the new non-gendered toilet rooms that are becoming common and preferred in California?
That's a good question. I've been following the latest code adoption process for the interim code cycle, but I haven't had time to follow it really closely. So what's in progress right now is the Building Standards Commission is in the process of adopting the interim code cycle for the 2019 codes. So DSA is center stage on all of that. To my knowledge, they're not taking the step yet to go about the business of aligning the plumbing code and the accessibility requirements so that it's easier for all of us to process. Not yet. What else have we got? Questions?
And the next question, if your renovation area is not a patient care area, like a pharmacy or lab, are all 5 toilets triggered or just staff toilets?
I love the good question. I love this. So we run into this a lot.
Bill and I talk about this a lot.
Yeah. So this isn't something that the code explicitly says, but there's a logic to it. The way the vast majority of this, vast majority of us in the industry and the folks at OSHPD process this is to say, if you have a staff-only project, if you're remodeling the sterilizers, replacing sterilizers is kind of a class example, then no, you don't trigger all 5 of those. These toilet rooms that serve this alteration would then only be staff toilet rooms. It's a great question. What else have you got? Any other questions?
This one will be easy. Public phone booth can be, it's a question, but public phone booth, can it be house phone ? So they're asking, can the house phone be your public phone? And
yeah,
the follow-on is no one-use public phone anymore, ! Everyone has cell phone, !
Yes, so there's a whole topic there, the whole telephone world. So I'm sure you guys could all appreciate these codes have been carried over from one code cycle to the next for a long time. Meanwhile, the world has changed and we all have cell phones. So public payphones hardly exist anymore. Now, when you look in the 1224 sections of the building code, there's very few places, I don't think there's any, where they say you have to have a public payphone. And this makes all the difference. When you run into accessibility requirements, they make this distinction. You have to have accessible features for telephones when they are public payphones. So you could, and people do often, provide a house phone, a phone that has a cord to it and it's kept behind the counter and the staff puts it up on the desk as needed. You don't have to do anything from an accessibility standpoint, and you can say, that's my public phone. Now, there's issues that go beyond that that are outside of our arena of accessibility, but we can save that for another time. We're getting into some weeds that are not so much related. I mean, there is a telephone component to this, but I want to stay on the path of travel thing. So I want to move on, but let's take the last question or two, and then we got to move on to keep us on track.
Okay, the next one was discuss California requirement for unisex signage at single occupancy toilets versus OSHPD male and female types.
So I'm going to cover that. I'm going to cover signage specifically for toilet rooms about a half hour from now. So I'll pick it up then. Are we ready to move on?
Actually, there is one I think we may want to address right now.
Yeah.
It's a follow-up question. If there is only one staff toilet room on a floor and it is made accessible, it does not seem appropriate that a path of travel mandate would require creating a second staff toilet room.
Well, that's a good question. So again, everybody's remodel projects are all a little bit different. When you run into that case where, okay, we don't have a separate male and female, we just have a unisex, and the next staff toilet room is a long way away. Are you seriously going to ask us to build a second toilet room just to satisfy this accessibility requirement? It's very unlikely. OSHPD may make the comment, but I doubt it they would. It's more likely that the comment may come up during plan review and you would respond saying, well, we've only got one of them and here's our floor plan, look for yourself. This is the best that we can do. And that's likely to resolve it. So I'm thinking we're ready to move on, right?
Okay.
Okay. All right, thank you. We covered that. It's going through the paces, gender neutral, questions. Okay, second case study, a little bit different. So this hypothetical case study is a medical office remodel. This one is a leased office space. So this gets into another layer of weirdness. So if our remodel project is a suite, and we have this happen all the time, say for our sake of discussion, say Sutter Health is leasing this suite and we're going to remodel it and create this medical office. So let's go through the path of travel obligations. I'll spare you all of the exterior piece and just focus on the toilet room part. So inside of our project, we're going to have a patient toilet. So obviously that has to be accessible, no questions there. Now, the male and female public toilet rooms are pretty commonly out there in the corridor. Assuming that's the case, this is where it gets really weird. By code, our project has to provide current code compliance for the toilet rooms that serve this project. That should be seen as including those public toilet rooms, but those aren't something we own. So we have to go to the building owner and say, gee, we have to talk. The building official says I have to upgrade these 2 toilet rooms to current code compliance, and we've done a little research, and that's going to require us to move this, and that, and we have to do it. So you have to get permission from the landlord, and you have to negotiate who pays for that, and it's always going to be us, is our experience. So that's the way it plays out. Now, you may have a building official that doesn't make you do that, but that's becoming less and less common. This is the way that I think that most of the time it plays out. Now, one other nuance to this, the male and female staff thing. You may not have staff toilet rooms in a typical medical office complex. If you do, technically speaking, they're supposed to be brought up to current code accessibility compliance. And that's a bitter pill to swallow. It's possible you could negotiate your way out of that, but again, technically speaking, that would be required. So that, like I say, it unravels a whole other category of stuff when you're dealing with leased medical offices. So do we have any questions specific to this one?
Not specific to this example.
Okay, what else have you got?
We have one for staff. Can you have alternative drinking fountain in lieu of high-low accessible drinking fountain? So this kind of goes back to your prior material, like drinking fountain in a staff lounge.
Yeah, that drinking fountain thing is changing a little bit these days, but now this one piece of it I may not have quite right, but I think in all of my work in hospitals and medical offices and clinics, there's no place that it says you have to have a drinking fountain. You can have no drinking fountains. If you do have drinking fountains, however, and you do a remodel project, you have to make them accessible, the ones that serve your area, and you have to provide separate high-low. So if you have in the question in a staff break room, if you have was it a drinking fountain or was it like a Sparkletts water dispenser? Because we get that question from time to time. What if we have a water dispenser? My answer would be, well, that's not a drinking fountain. You don't have the high-low obligation from a building code standpoint. You may want to look carefully at how you treat your employees to make sure that all of your staff are able to use the drinking facilities, but it's not a quote unquote drinking fountain. So the code doesn't apply to it.
If you are providing a water dispenser, would that also need, so say if you were in a waiting room that has it's providing coffee and a water dispenser, would both those devices then need to be compliant accessible?
Yeah, so what we're getting into is it's not a path of travel thing. It's not triggered necessarily by doing a remodel project. You may very well want to do it, but it's an amenity. You're providing a place for somebody to get a cup of coffee, or which also is not part of your building. You're dealing with furniture now. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. There's legal obligations. It's just not a building code thing. What ends up driving the solution is reach range. So you want to provide reach range and operable part compliance to all of those kind of things. If it's actually attached to the building and it would be interpreted to be subject to building code requirements, which is an interpretive thing, then yes, it would have to meet by code the reach range compliance and the operable part compliance. So I could see we could go on with path of travel for another hour, but I'm pressed for time. I want to make sure an hour until our lunch break, and we got some material to cover. So with your permission, I'm going to go move on. So the toilet area time bomb. So this is something I developed for a seminar at the time of the 2016 building code development. So what this is, as most of you who've been in the profession for a while are keenly aware, the building code changed in the 2013 code cycle from what's shown on the left, what it was for years and years and years, 28 inches between the side of the toilet and the side of the lavatory, to the new way of doing it, which is 60 inches from a wall to any possible obstruction in the toilet area. That amounts to about a 5-inch differential. The way you measure it's different, so it's not literally 5 inches, but my experience has been more or less, this means it needs to be 5 inches bigger. So where this takes us, our toilet area time bomb, grandfathering no longer helps. So the text shown in red allows us to go back to the immediately preceding edition of the building code. That used to be valuable back when it went to a code that had the old style measuring system. But now, ever since the 2016 code, you go back one code cycle, it doesn't help you because you're going back to the same standard that we're under now. So that's the essence of our toilet area time bomb. So when we do a remodeling project, we stumble into this project, we're going to remodel, we have to do the path of travel obligation, which includes specifically our toilet rooms. But if the building was built prior to the 2010 code cycle, then we've got a problem because it was probably built to the earlier standard. So we wait for the bomb to go off. And then here we are, boom. So as you can see, we're having a little bit of fun, so to speak, with building code discussion. So what that is, let me give you a bit of an example. Recently, we've had a project up at Sutter, Roseville, in the area that I live here. And I'll spare you the gory details, but more or less, our remodel project spans a large geographic area of the hospital. We were going to be subject to toilet room compliance in the range of possibly 20 to 30 different toilet rooms. So I went through myself with a tape measure and measured all of our toilet rooms that are single user toilet rooms. And over and over and over and over again, it's about 55 inches from the wall to the lavatory because they were built to 2010 and earlier code cycles. That's the problem. Now, our remodel project triggers current code compliance, and that's supposed to be 60 inches, and our project is supposed to make it so. That's a tall order. So what I want to do is show you kind of a possible way to diffuse the bomb. So if you've got a toilet room that is of these dimensions, there may be a way out where you don't have to move the walls, and that would be spinning the lavatory 90 degrees. So if the dimensions, if you're lucky enough, if the toilet room is just big enough, you may be able to make that fly. Otherwise, you're into it for moving walls, and that gets costly. Now, one aspect of this, the deep ADA compliance code geeks are probably way ahead of me on this. This could create an alcove condition. So there's an alcove if you're asking a wheelchair user to pull in forward and then turn 90 degrees to use the facilities, and they're bounded on 3 sides. That's an alcove. And the alcove requirement asks you to make it much bigger. So we don't want this to be interpreted to be an alcove. The way that you might be able to escape that is if you can pull the lavatory down towards the door, but still make that 60-inch minimum door clearance requirement. So as you can see, this becomes very technically involved. There's a lot of dimensions that you have to get just right. But if you can, and a lot of them we do, you're going to save yourself a ton of money. So before I move on from that, any questions that have come up on this one, Mr. Bill?
Nothing specific to this example.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back, a little bit of a bio break. So let's see, according to my clock, it's 10:33, 10:34. We'll come back in about 5 minutes. I'm so sorry. I'm actually delivering seminar right now. I was supposed to get back to you a couple of days ago. I've been, yeah, I'm going to be in the seminar all day, so I'll leave a note here and make a point to get back to you tonight. Okay, I'm so sorry. Take care. Okay, folks, so I'm coming back. I don't know if we've gone through the full 5 minutes yet. Let me peek ahead and see what's next. Oh, the employee workstation exemption. So, yeah, go
There
ahead.
are some questions related to the last toilet room example. I think very specific to that slide. Might be worth going back just briefly.
To which part?
The sink turned sideways. So the first question, let's see if we can go through these. Can you just go to a thinner sink?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
sink in its original position just be thinner.
that is possible. I've tried at times, I've done the math to figure out, can we do that? Can we find a tiny, tiny, tiny sink and get that additional 5 inches we need? I've never found one that is usable that we could make work. I've wondered the same thing. Now, so to answer the question, yes, if you could get a thin sink and make up that 5-inch difference, you know, more power to you. What else? Other questions on that?
Yes, there are. So someone asked, recently they completed a remodel of a staff toilet as shown in the exhibit that you have there with the sink turned sideways. And they were cited for the side of the sink being higher than 27 inches for protruding objects, since the sink apron height was at 29 inches to the bottom. Is that normally cited code for this application?
Well, they've got a point. The plant checker has a good point. When you enter this room, if you're sight impaired and you're using a cane, you would walk right into that side of that lav. So it is subject to the cane detection requirements. Yep. I think a lot of people would not catch that. So your easy solution is you put a vertical fin or something of that nature that's cane detectable. You could work through it. Frankly, that's a good catch on the building official's part. Okay, what else?
Let's see here. I think that addresses the ones. Oh, here's one more. On the toilet room with the rotated sink, this has been an issue for the accessibility route within the room and the sink protruding into the accessible route. I think that's the cane detection again.
Yeah, same thing. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
All right, what we were talking a little earlier at the break, when we break for lunch, I'm gonna stay on for a while to answer as many questions as we have. So if we run out of time, we'll deal with it that way. So upward and onward, the employee workstation exemption. So this is a whole topic unto itself. So let me start with some definitions. We got a definition, this is right out of the building code, for a common use area. So as a reminder, that is an area not for public use for 2 or more people. Now, very similar to that is the employee work area definition, which is also to be used only by employees and only for work. A little different, but kind of similar. And then separately, we have a workstation thing. So this is one of those things that my friends from out of state wrestle with. And I want to explain why. The workstation definition shown here, it's a California thing. It's adopted for the California Building Code. So the point here, this hasn't run through the courts. For the most part, when we have these discussions with all of our code consultants, eventually Jim Terry or one of our experts will be able to say, oh yeah, that thing came up in a court. Here's what happened, here's how it played out, this is what the judge decided. The workstation definition, no, that hasn't worked its way through courts as far as we know. So what exactly a workstation is up for interpretation, and the US Access Board cannot help us out on this. So this generates a lot of debate. So the definition as it's defined in the building code, it's generally for one or a small number of employees at a time. Now, there's a whole lot of room for interpretation. So I want to show you kind of some broad brushstroke examples. The employee work areas need to be accessible. So this is the big area. It's more or less typically a whole room or a whole area. That's for doing your work duty in the employee work area. Now, separate from that is the employee workstation. They tend to be an individual spot for one person. Now, in our healthcare world, we have our facilities running 24/7, 365. So at one spot, you may very well have 3 different people that work there during a single day at different times in the day. That makes this whole discussion subject to debate. Now, the way I've seen it applied by most people most of the time, it's understood that a workstation is a finite spot for one person to work doing their work duty. Now, that's important because there's a broad-reaching exception for the employee workstation, which is, I believe, on the next slide. So 11B 203.9, that gives us an exception. And this is significant. What this says is if you have a workstation, then you don't have to make it accessible at all, except for this laundry list of items here. So I'm going to take these one at a time. The 5 that are shown in black text have been there in this exception for a while. The 2 that are shown in red were added recently. So the first one, the 207.1, the accessible means of egress. So this is almost always a slam dunk. What we're saying here is if you have that finite small workstation for one person, does it comply with the accessible means of egress? Well, it almost always will, because the accessible means of egress is most likely your elevator or stair tower, which may be 100 feet away. It's not actually inside of your workstation. So you can check that off almost always as a slam dunk comply. We go to the next one, the fire alarm system. Similarly, that has really nothing to do with your workstation. It's not inside of your workstation. Another slam dunk. The 302 section on floor surfaces, we're almost always going to comply with this. Unless you have a floor made out of gravel, you're going to comply with the floor surface requirements. Then the change of level, as long as your floor is one flat floor surface, you're going to comply with that. And then I want to skip down to the 404.2.3, the other one that's in black text. Do you have a clear width of a door? Well, do you have a door inside of your little tiny workstation? Most likely not. So the point I want to drive home is you're going to comply with almost all of these all the time at a workstation. The broad exception for workstation compliance is a very valuable exception. Now, the 2 items that were added in red text, those are a problem. They could very well be deal breakers. So I'm going to show a slide or 2 on dealing with that. What this is saying, even though you have a workstation, you have to make the electrical switches and electrical outlets that are there at your workstation, they have to meet the reach range requirements. Now, there's an exception to the exception. So the code writers must love that. If the receptacles, controls, and switches are an integral part of the workstation, then it kind of undoes the text in red, and now you don't have to make them comply. That too can be valuable. So I'm going to show you an example, and it's a little bit of a complicated slide. Not this one, but the next one. This is the essence of the reach range issue. So when we put an electrical outlet or a switch at our workstation, We have to make sure we meet these 3 reach requirements. Now, this is potentially a problem. If you have a countertop we run into this a lot, at 36 inches, well, you're no longer compliant. Those 2 electrical outlets at the back wall are not reachable. And that would mean, even though you say, hey, it's a workstation, you have to demonstrate compliance, and that would be a problem. Or if your countertop is a typical 24-inch countertop that hangs 1 inch over the base cabinet and actually measures at 25 inches, that would be non-compliance. So let me show you this slide. It's a little bit busy, but this is kind of a garden variety example in a utility room where we have to make sure the countertop height doesn't exceed 34, that the electrical outlets don't exceed 46, and that the countertop doesn't exceed 24 inches. And this is specifically applicable at a workstation. So that's a bit of a problem. So I want to pause here. I don't know if I've got a question slide. I guess I do. So pausing here, do we have questions that this has generated?
Yeah, related to the last material, does a janitor's closet need to be accessible inside? Example, a 5-foot turning radius.
Yeah, good question. Technically, no. Now, this is one that everybody, almost everybody, gets in the habit of saying you have to have a turning circle. You know, you have to. Well, that's actually not the way the code reads. The building code, the California Building Code and the ADA standards do not say you have to have a turning circle in every single room, always. It doesn't say that. You have to have a turning circle in a toilet room. You have to have a turning circle in a patient bedroom and an exam and treatment rooms, but you can have no turning circle in a janitor's closet or storage room. Now, my experience has been building officials will frequently fight you on that. And I'm not sure I would advise you to design such that you don't have a turning circle. It's not what I would consider to be good design. But if you want to fight it, you could make the argument and ask the building official to show me where it says I have to have a turning circle in a storage room or in a janitor's closet. And they're going to be left most likely making broad statements that aren't specific. Other question?
Would occupancy sensors waive the electrical switch component requirement?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it's the sort of thing a building official will have to respond to. I think it's legit. My personal, the point is, if it's a light switch that turns on a light so you can see and use this space at night and it automatically turns on when you're in the room, well, what's the problem? So I would think so, yeah. Next. Anything else?
And then we have some more toilet room questions, but I think we can hold those to the next.
Yeah, maybe we'll hold the toilet room questions till the lunch break, and I'll just kind of spill over into lunch on those.
Oh, there is one more. Workstations.
Okay. Yeah.
This is that one or small number of people. What does small mean? 2 people, 3 people, 5 people?
I love the question. Obviously, it's debatable, and we've had this debate before with OSHPD and various building officials. I don't know how I can answer. I can't answer definitively. So I've made the pitch before that we've got a room and it's the whole room. I want to call it a workstation. Can I do that? And in this particular case, OSHPD said, no, it's not necessarily just for one person. I think in this case, it might have been a utility room. So I have to leave it kind of as a non-answer. There is no definitive on that one. What
Okay,
else?
and it does appear we have a few more. Can 2-11B states reception desks, nurse stations, clean and soiled utility rooms, clean linen storage, and nourishment areas, including built-in cabinets and hand washing fixtures, must be fully compliant with relevant sections of 11B. Does this mean the counters, sinks, etc. must also meet accessibility?
Yes. In a word, yes. We're going to cover that in the afternoon section. That's 11B 805.7. And that's where the code giveth and the code taketh away. The exception I was just talking about, OSHPD is taken away for those specific circumstances. So we'll go over that in more detail in the afternoon.
Sounds good. And there's a related question to that we'll hold on to, Matt Comp's question, later this afternoon, Matt.
All right, so now we're going to get into an interesting, kind of fun, wild and woolly code section here. So tightly defined workstations. So full disclosure, this is something that I've just made up. And I got to put that in the context. I'm connected to a lot of people that are very, very smart people that are very good at this arena. I think every last one of them understands the issues at stake and is willing to go along with the way I'm looking at this. So let me break into the tightly defined workstation discussion. So what we have is a commingling problem where we have patients and employees in the same room at the same time. So when that happens, logic would state that the stricter standard must prevail. So in all of that stuff that we have on the walls and all that stuff that the staff has to have access to, well, does all of it have to be mounted in a way that meets the access requirements? That's the rub. So the way I try to get out of this is by developing what I call the tightly defined workstation. It's what I call code spin, drawing from my days as a disc jockey, twin spin. So the idea here is that you would draw a tight little circle around your particular thing on the wall and say, hey, that little thing, that's a little itty bitty workstation. We're going to exempt it from all those accessibility requirements because it is strictly for the use of employees and that's strictly for them doing their actual work duty. Now, that has a solid foundation in ADA law that employees doing their work duty are allowed to reach for something over a 48-inch height. They are allowed to operate things that take more than 5 pounds to operate. That happens all the time and it's been tested in court. So my cute little nuance here is to say, hey, here's what we're going to do to get out of that situation of commingling. We're going to take a typical patient care area, draw a tight little circle around the thing that the employees are using and say, hey, that thing there is a workstation for the purposes of applying accessibility requirements. And that kind of gets us out of a crazy, crazy land. So we would do that in this circumstance, another photo of a patient bedroom. So I would draw a tight little circle around those things and say, hey, that's a workstation. Now I want to relate this piece of it right here back to those two exceptions that were in red text that said the switches and electrical outlets nonetheless have to comply, even though it's a workstation. Now, there was an exception to the exception, as you recall. So I'm going to say, okay, well, whether it's literally true or not, I want to argue that this is an integral part of the workstation equipment. It's built in, so to speak. So I'm going to argue that on that basis, we get that exception. So far, this has worked for us. And I don't consider it to be crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. Next example, the employee health records. So that specifically does need to be compliant. OSHPD has said so. These elements here on the wall, I would say, hey, that's an employee-only operated element. Exempt it from the height requirements. Obviously, the radiology equipment, the surgical lights, nobody is going to make you try to make all of the operable parts meet code requirements for reach range, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the concept that we apply when it makes sense to do so. And the dividing line here is this something that's used by staff and strictly for them doing their actual work duty? If so, I want to exempt it. So that's my wild and woolly, tightly defined workstation discussion. Do we have any questions on this?
There's a couple of questions about cabinets. Is the over 48-inch reach allowed for overhead cabinets in an exam room?
Yeah, so that again we'll cover in the afternoon, but the short answer is this. If you have upper cabinets only in an employee area in a healthcare facility, that's a problem. You have to provide a minimum of one type of that thing that's within reach range. And again, we'll cover that in the afternoon. That's the same code section, 11B 805.7. Any other questions?
Nope, not at this time.
All right, so to round out scoping, there's a few miscellaneous code sections we want to cover. So this is related to parking. This is specifically healthcare stuff. So buried in there in the parking requirements, you all probably remember when you do parking, there's a table in the code that says you need this many accessible parking stalls for that many overall stalls. So this is a requirement specific to hospital outpatient facilities. It's a 10% requirement. Now, the operative word here is hospital. So we at Sutter, of course, have quite a few of these out there. The language in the code says hospital outpatient facilities. So what we would do is consult our license. Does the hospital license list this outpatient facility? If it does, even though it may be a mile away from the hospital, it would nonetheless be qualified as a hospital outpatient facility. Now, if it's not on the license, it's not a hospital outpatient facility, and the 10% requirement would not apply. So this is that table of note. 10% is significantly different than what this table shows. If you track through the percentage, it starts at the top with what amounts to 4%. At 1 to 25, one stall would be about 4%. And as you get your parking lots get bigger, it comes down to 2%. 10% is significantly different than that. So don't blow this one and miss it, because you'll miss a big number of accessible parking stalls. Similar to that is then the rehab and physical therapy parking requirement. So this is a 20% requirement, and this is not specific to hospitals. So this would be the classic version of this as a rehab outpatient facility or a physical therapy facility. And again, that 20% is a big difference from the typical table application. So I want to show you a kind of a case study that runs through this. Again, the table from the parking sections in code, that 4%, 2%, 10, and 20. So the case study, just for the sake of helping talk this through, if you've got a medical office building and there's your parking lot, let's walk through how this works. So if you have 150 parking stalls, per the table, you would have to make 5 of them accessible stalls. We do that all the time. Now, if the whole building were an outpatient clinic of a hospital on the hospital license, then the application would be 10%, and that's a big jump of 15 ADA stalls. And then finally, if the whole building was a rehab clinic, then the application would be 20% of 150 or 30 stalls. And again, you can see the big jump. So you don't want to miss this one. Now, in the world of reality, the more likely scenario is we would have one suite in the building that is an outpatient clinic of a hospital or a rehab clinic. So then what you have to do is, like, your high school math teacher said, you have to show your work. What you would do, and we run into this all the time, is say, well, here's the deal, and put it on paper to show the building official. If we have 150 parking stalls for the whole building and our clinic is only maybe, I don't know, maybe 20% of the building, then 20% of the parking is our parking, and we have to do the 20% of just that piece of it, not the whole building. So you have to run through the math and make some assumptions on how much of that parking lot actually serves your suite. So that is that. Do we have any questions on this, Mr. Whipple?
No, we do not. We do have some follow-up questions. It takes a little while for them to come in on the employee workstation. So 3 of those that have now come in.
Oh, okay. Let's take them now. Go ahead.
Okay. So first is a comment. Someone expressed that it may be best to comply with the turning circle in that they're seeing that oftentimes rooms that were intended for storage are turned into offices at a later date. It's a pretty thoughtful answer or a thought. The second, though, is the actual question is about how high, how about high-level monitors at bedsides? Can you have the electrical outlet higher than 48 inches? That is not counted as a workstation. So imagine a telemetry monitor, physiological monitor that is at a patient bedside. Those are often above 48 inches.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the electrical scoping thing is a source of frustration, I think, for a lot of accessibility people, because it reads like a light switch. It's on or it's off. They don't give you a scoping percentage. The way the code language reads, electrical outlets, plural, or switches, plural. So some people try to apply it in a logical way. They won't necessarily make you have every single electrical outlet in the room meet reach range requirements. Some people will, but some people won't. Nonetheless, that's not really this question. This question is an electrical outlet that serves a monitor. It's a dedicated outlet. I don't think anybody's going to make that meet accessibility requirements. The intent for this reach range compliance is if in a reasonable scenario, somebody who's using the room is going to plug something into that outlet. It's not intended to apply to when you move into the hospital and you plug the monitor in. Nobody cares whether it is this high or that high. Any other questions on that?
The next question is, how does this tightly defined workstation requirement differ from being required to provide an accessible staff workstation in a specific workroom, such as a nuke med hot lab?
I'm not sure I follow the. So let me try to explain it this way. In a nuke med hot lab, you would have to do all of the accessibility requirements so that somebody in a wheelchair could pull up to the counter and work at the work surface. You don't get away from that because that's not you doing your work duty. You're just rolling up to use the space. what you could argue is if you've got something that's mounted on the wall that happens to be then subject to building code requirements because it's part of the architecture of the building, and it's mounted higher than 48 inches, depending on what it is, I might say, well, that's part of the employee's work duty. They operate this gizmo up on the wall, and we kind of have to have it at 53 inches or whatever. That's the argument I would make. So I don't know how else to answer that one.
So this would be typical, right? Bill, like pharmacy, a lab. So if it's part of the normal work duty of the staff, then you're saying it should be accessible.
Yeah, but yes. That does require some conversation. It all revolves around doing your work duty, and there's still some exceptions to that. So in the context of doing your work duty, one example that we've run into, say in the back area of a hospital, we've got the kitchen. We may have our pots and pans up on a shelf or gizmos that are on the wall that the staff need to get to. Maybe the switch that you turn to activate the fire sprinkler emergency system, that may be mounted above a 48-inch height. And I'm going to say, well, but that's part of their work duty. That's differentiated from getting to the place that they do their work duty and having a countertop set at a height where they'll be able to work. This is debatable stuff, but that's where it takes us. And it's, there are long, heated discussions that occur over this topic. So I don't want us to get too far behind. I got to keep pushing on. And let me take one last question at this point, and then we'll move on.
I think that's many of them. I think we can address in the afternoon session. Okay,
so last scoping thing I wanted to cover here, the covered passenger loading zone. So in the 206 and 209 code sections, there's two different code sections related to each other. The first one relates to a weather protection. So this is specifically at medical care and long-term care facilities where you have 24-hour care. You have to have weather protection at the passenger drop-off and loading zone. And then the 209 section at medical care and long-term facilities, you have to have at least one passenger drop-off and loading zone. They're closely related to each other. So I'm going to go through and kind of show you a bit of an example to illustrate this. There are a couple of things going on here. So I've got a section of a site plan on the upper left and kind of a section on the lower right. What the requirements do, I've got a vertical red line shown. By the code language, you have to cover at least the access aisle. Now, really good architects will extend the covering all the way over the car because it makes a lot of sense. That's good design, but the code language requires simply that you cover the access aisle. You have to have detectable warnings, which is a whole other thing. And then the thing that I think catches a lot of people off guard, the vehicle standing space, which is represented on the slide by a little orange thin rectangle, that has to be a 2% maximum slope. That one frequently people miss. That's the last scoping thing. And I got to say, most hospitals already have this. It's very rare that you even run into this, but we actually ran into it in our barrier removal work as part of our lawsuit. We found that one of our hospitals was built and doesn't have a covered passenger loading zone. What they happen to have is a covered area that's separated from the front door. So you could get dropped off out of the rain, but then you have to make a mad dash to the door in the rain. So our project is building a connection between the two for ADA purposes. So I think that takes me to the end of this section. And I'm going to just roll right into the next one to keep us on time. So we all know, toilet rooms is the center of the universe in the ADA world. So I'm going to walk through a couple of things that we have found works for us. I'm going to try to cover the rest of this material in about 15 minutes, and we'll break for lunch at roughly 11:30. So first piece of this, in a typical floor plan layout, we're going to talk about signage, the trash can location, the grab bars, and the lavatory. So first piece of this is signage. I'm going to break this down into 4 components. First is the room identification. So the words on the sign there, that from a technical standpoint, that is the room identification. That has to be in raised letter with Braille. This element over here on the door, that's the geometric symbol, which is a California thing that we have to have, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Now the 2 figures here, that's a pictogram. And then finally, this element here is the International Sign of Access. I'm going to go through each one of these separately. So the room identification sign, that's what tells people this is this kind of room. It's a restroom in this case. That has to have the Braille. Now, for gender neutral, we want to be careful about how you say it. For our purposes at Sutter, we've settled on restroom or toilet room. We don't typically say gender neutral toilet room because it's simply a little bit long. So that's the one piece of that. Separate from that is the pictogram. So you may or may not know this, that's not required by code. That's optional. Now, we choose to do it, and I think for very good reason, because everybody understands that. No matter what language you happen to speak, everybody gets that that's a man, that's a woman, those are the symbols that tell you whether this is for men or women or unisex. That next element there, that's the international symbol of accessibility. I think most everybody gets. You only put those on a toilet room that meets access requirements. And then the last piece of this is the geometric symbol. So that's a California specific thing. You can place it either beside the door or on the door. Now in discussions we've had, the purpose of this, before I blow by that, the purpose is to help people that are partially sighted. And there are actually more people that are partially sighted by far than people that are totally blind. This is to address their ability to find the toilet rooms and to tell which genders are allowed in the toilet rooms. Now, we've had some long discussions with DSA over this topic. A lot of sign makers will put on the symbol the ISA or the male and female figures. DSA doesn't like it. Long story short, they're purists that from this standpoint, they believe this is what the code requires. It should be clean and uncluttered with anything else on it. I've argued that point with them, but in the end, it's not really a big deal. I'm just as happy to put the male and female figure off to the side and put my ISA off to the side. So that's my whole little quick run on signage. Now I want to go to the trash can discussion. So this is a big issue with us. From a practical standpoint, if you've got a toilet room that, again, we all design to be as small and tight as we can get it, what you find is there's almost no room in the room to put a freestanding trash can. When you count up all of the areas that are shown in blue, it takes up the whole room, all of the required clearances. So where do you put the trash can? What we like to do is use a semi-recessed, that works well. And what we know, we understand, our maintenance people, because they don't want to empty the trash can 3 times a day, they find the semi-recessed trash can is not big enough to suit them. And that's where the rub is. So when our staff decides, well, we're going to put a second trash can in and we're just going to place it anywhere we feel like it, then our ADA compliance people come in periodically and say, well, you've got a trash can right in the middle of the clearance that's required underneath the lavatory or in the toilet clearance or in the doorway. Bottom line, if you want to have a separate freestanding toilet room, you probably have to make the toilet room a little bit bigger. Now let's talk a little bit about grab bars. So grab bars are a little bit of a sore spot with us. We find that is one of the most commonly messed up parts for accessibility in our buildings. It comes up almost every time we do a survey of an existing building. So the issue here is the code requires the back rear grab bar to be 36 inches long with 12 inches on the short side and 24 inches on the wide side. It adds up exactly to be 36 inches. So if you specify a rear grab bar that is exactly 36 inches long, you have to place it exactly in the right place. Otherwise, if it's a little bit too far to the left, it's non-compliant. If it drifts a little too far to the right, it's non-compliant. And we have that, like I say, on almost every project where we do a survey of an existing building. Those are found to be non-compliant. The same thing occurs with the side grab bar. Solution is just specify a longer grab bar. That will save you so many headaches down the road. So it's not very technical, short and sweet. I do want to take you through another issue. I'm going to rip through the slide here. So there's a 12-inch clearance required above the grab bar. So specific to healthcare, we have these elements on the wall for a nurse call. You got to keep those above that no-fly zone of 12 inches above the grab bar. You have to. The grab bar has to have 12 inches clear above it. Now, we frequently get into debates about, okay, well, that nurse call thing, the nurse has to come in and reset it by physically resetting a button on that. If we place it above a 48-inch height, is that okay? And our answer is yes, that's okay. It's one of those specific things that's a part of the work duty of the staff. And that's why I do my little, we're going to call it a little itty bitty workstation. Also of note, would not recommend putting these combination units behind the grab bar. And the reason, long story short, is that that hole in the top is the problem. You're supposed to be able to use the grab bar and lean with your forearm or even your shoulder up against that space of the wall, and you're not supposed to have it sink into a hole. So I know it's done often. I'm not sure I'd say it's a huge problem, but you're going to run into people that are access compliance folks that are going to tell you, technically that's not compliant. And we've already talked about that. So I want to move to the issue of lavatories. So this one, we've got stories I could tell, but I'll spare you that. The recommendation, while code requires an 18-inch difference from the side wall to the center line of the lavatory, it's probably something you guys have run into a million times before, I'd recommend going more like 21 inches. And the reason is the paper towel dispensers that we all put on the wall, we don't want it to encroach upon that space. Now, we've had an ongoing debate, quite frankly, with a particular OSHPD field staff who maintains that that area, that 18-inch required area, shall have nothing in it. And so every time that particular person cites us, and frequently it doesn't come up until the building's already been built and it's done, and he walks through on his final walkthrough and says, oh yeah, those paper towel dispensers, no, you can't do that. We vehemently disagree with them, but we're at a great disadvantage when the building has already been built and we are waiting to occupy. So frequently we found ourselves having to move them. So save yourself the headache and the argument, and to the extent possible, mount your lavatory more like 21 inches from the sidewall and give yourself some room for the paper towel dispenser. Okay, last topic I'm going to tackle before lunch. I'm going to need about 5 minutes on this one. So this is the OshPod CAN 2-11B. I alluded earlier to, I actually helped write the first iteration of this when I was at OshPod in 2008. Now it's been updated a couple of times since then, but it's kind of nice to know some of the language I wrote is still in there. So I'm going to rip through kind of quick. This is an 18-page document. It's specific to healthcare facilities. This is OshPod's interpretation. And I want to be clear about a piece of this. When OshPod interprets stuff, accessibility or anything else, they're held to a pretty high standard. And it may be that a lot of you aren't aware of this. OshPod is not allowed to make up code. They're not allowed to interpret that is effectively rewriting the code. So when OshPod issues any document that interprets code, it runs through quite the process internal so that they can vet it and make sure, and it runs through legal counsel to make sure they're not, by way of their interpretations, blowing off code sections or just essentially rewriting things that they want it to be. They're not allowed to do that. So this 18-page document seeks to clarify stuff without going out of bounds. So I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail and kind of run you through some of the specifics. So a few essential points. They make a point that changes of use do trigger current code compliance, as does a structural repair project. Anchorage work is not considered structural and does not trigger path of travel work. Now there's a whole topic about the unreasonable hardship and the 20% threshold thing. This document walks you through how OshPod interprets that. An important piece of that is how you defined the, what's the term that's used? The construction cost. From time to time, this one comes up and it's in this interpretive document. That's to include the cost of the equipment. And it doesn't matter if you borrow the piece of equipment or if you already own it and you move it from some other building to this building, or if you're leasing it. What OshPod's going to want to do is say, let's find what we can agree is the market value of that equipment. And that gets included in your construction cost to develop your hardship request threshold. So there's a lot going on there. I want to just direct you to that document for further discussion. Some of the other essential points, there's the single element does not trigger path travel. So if what you're doing is replacing one element in a room, that in and of itself does not trigger path of travel. However, if you're remodeling what is interpreted to be the whole room, and that's a loosey-goosey interpretive thing, then OshPod's going to say, well, you bought the whole thing. You've bought the whole room, and the whole room needs to be brought up to current code, and that's going to require compliance for the hand washing fixture. Now, there's a discussion of elements that are not in a room, and I specifically wrote that section of code because I'd run into this from time to time where a project is something like replacing doors throughout the hospital. And then you try to track down all the toilet rooms that could possibly be interpreted as serving the area, you could end up with a ridiculous number of toilet rooms. So OSHPD in this document, they discuss how to apply that, and they do accept centralized toilet rooms. There's discussion of the technically infeasible, the path of travel, which we already covered, the 200-foot rule, which we already covered. Barrier removal projects that are court ordered. And then the exempt projects, which are mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and that specifically includes fire alarm and fire sprinkler projects. The adjusted construction cost, that's the term I was looking for earlier. So I mentioned that already. The employee workstation, we've talked about that. The percentages, the number crunching. So this item number 19 is kind of an interesting thing. So water closets in the shower area may not overlap. And I know back in the day, we used to do this all the time where to save space, we'd say, well, my toilet required area and my turning circle required area will overlap the shower area because, hey, we've just got a curtain. OSHPD has put their foot down and said, no, they're not going to allow that. That's noted in this guidance document. And then the last couple of items on this, we've got bedpan flushers versus grab bars. You are not allowed to shift or split the grab bar. They do mention that, as I mentioned earlier, non-accessible patient bedrooms are not required to meet the mobility features. The scoping for exam and diagnostic treatment is indeed 100%. They do interpret, so I want to slow down on this one. We're going to cover this in the afternoon, but in OSHPD's CAN, they do note exam, diagnostic, and treatment areas, which are required to have a 36-inch aisle along the side. Their interpretation is that includes the foot of the table. And again, we'll talk about that more in the afternoon. Hand washing fixtures must be accessible. And finally, the electronic health records must have a clear floor space in front of them. So I know I ripped through that pretty quick. I wanted to keep us more or less on track with time. I'll take questions at this point. Those of you that want to go ahead and take your lunch break, feel free to do that. I'll stay on and take questions as long as people want to ask questions, but we'll start up again at 12:30. So let me turn it back to my friend Bill Whipple. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, so on the toilet rooms, let's start with that. Question from Lauren. If a toilet room was compliant before 2010, but is no longer compliant, should the ISA be removed from the door signage?
So great question. So we've had this come up from time to time, and I've found myself almost lecturing some of our own people. This is a goofy, strange scenario, and I'm sure it happens a lot. So the way I like to respond to this, the building code, the building officials are only authorized to enforce the building code to the extent that you're submitting a project for plan review and building it. When you're done, when they close that project number, then you're done. The building department no longer has authority over you. So if your project put an ISA on the wall because it met those standards at that time, don't worry about it. Now, the standards may have moved on. That happens all the time. It doesn't mean you're no longer compliant and you need to take that sign off the wall. Does not mean that. Now, when you start remodeling, well, yeah, okay, that issue comes up. You may find yourself remodeling it then. So am I explaining that in a way that makes sense?
I think so. So if you're remodeling this particular toilet room that was built before 2010, you would need to remove the ISA from the door. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I see your point. I may have answered the thing I wanted to say and not really answer the question. So yeah, if you're doing a remodel and you're remodeling a building that was built, say, in the year 2000, it's 20 years old. It was compliant back in the year 2000, but it's not now. And if it is indeed your, so let me respond to this carefully. Yeah, I guess it needs to, we have to take this apart kind of piece by piece. So your building code obligation to meet the path of travel requirement, you point to a certain toilet room and say that one meets current code for accessibility. You finish that, you meet that obligation. If there's another toilet room, say it's down the hall, and you didn't identify it as meeting current code and being your identified toilet room as your path of travel obligation, and it's just sitting there, it does bring up a hypothetical question. Should you take the ISA off of the door? I mean, the building official, I don't think, has the authority to make you do that. I suppose one could. I don't think, and the way I've described this to one of our staff, where we had this whole discussion about, I don't know, 3 years ago, I don't think you're helping people that are disabled by removing a sign that tells them, that leads them to believe that they can't use that room. If what we're really trying to do is help people with disabilities, really, are you helping somebody by taking the sign off of this door as your construction project built a different one? I mean, I would argue to leave it alone. That's the way I'd handle it. I could certainly see how people would handle it differently. So
There
that's
was
that
a
one.
follow-on comment by
Yeah.
the participant that thought that maybe you would have to do both the signage on the door and adjacent in that instance. So for example, if this toilet was meeting the path of travel requirements and you didn't want to have to upgrade it, you might still have to provide signage on both the door and adjacent to it. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So what we've run into, it does get into a different arena a little bit. So I want to break apart two different pieces of the discussion, and this is a good discussion when we have our brain trust of accessibility experts on our once a month call. This is the kind of thing we lay out there, and everybody's got different opinions, and we talk it through. They're not always black and white answers. So the things I want to break apart, your obligations as your construction project, say we're remodeling radiology, you're replacing radiology equipment and you're doing your path of travel, you could do that whole exercise and be given a building permit and be good to go. Separate from that is a barrier removal obligation. That's the law. And from that arena, you could say, well, our obligation is to let people know when this toilet room is not accessible, we want to put a sign on that wall next to the toilet room and tell them, oh, the accessible toilet room, that's 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet down to the left. I would capture that as a barrier removal obligation, not necessarily triggered by the construction project. Now, that's the way I would see it. Doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way to see it. So what do you think? Is that?
So the safest bet would be if you have an existing ISA on a pre-2010 door, the safest bet is you would provide a subsequent one adjacent to the door. That
Yeah,
for sure
I think
would
that's,
comply.
yeah, I think that's probably honestly the better solution the more that we talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. And then this still in toilet rooms, and this is related to some other spaces. The electrical code specifies where the nurse call box is supposed to be. This locates it in the 12-inch required clear area above the grab bar. So what they're asking here is you've got a conflict between the grab bar in the electrical code requirement.
So I'm not sure that's right. I'd have to look it up, but I believe the nurse call code requirement tells us the string has to go within 12 inches of the floor. If I'm wrong on that, if the code actually says you have to place the box at a specific height, well, number one, I'd be kind of surprised. And number two, that means you cannot put it in an accessible toilet room there where you could reach it at the toilet. And let's be honest, the utility of that is for somebody who's sitting on the toilet and they have a medical emergency, they need help, they need that nurse call string to be right there. You can't put it on a different wall where it's out of their reach from sitting on the toilet. So I got to conclude we have to put it on that wall. I don't think the code says it has to be in that specific spot within 12 inches above the grab bar. You know, I've been wrong before, so I want to leave a little room for that. We'd have to look that one up.
Okay. Next question, can recessed accessories such as paper towel dispenser and trash can be in the door clearance, although the cover of these accessories does not flush with wall surfaces?
So I think I know what the question is. So let me answer it this way. What happens pretty often is we'll have a door that swings into a toilet room and it swings against a wall. There is a little bit of a gap in the framing that pushes that door jamb out 3 or 4 inches from the surface of the wall. So if you travel down that wall and you have a paper towel dispenser that sticks out from the wall 3 or 4 inches, I'm going to look at that and say, well, it's not really in the door clearance because the door clearance doesn't really start until you reach that 3 or 4 inch distance. So I think that's okay. That's the way most of the people that I work with would interpret that. I'm not 100% sure that's what the questioner is asking.
Yeah, I think there's some nuance there. They're asking specifically about the cover of those accessories. So they may have a garbage can that may have a large cover. And so is it, we get in these situations of you may only have a small part of an accessory that encroaches into a clearance. Is it black and white that all of that accessory should not encroach?
Yeah, well, so that's down in the weeds. I'm not saying they're wrong. I think the questioner has a point. By the book, and I put it this way because there are some times when people like myself will roll our eyes and go, well, yeah, technically that's true. It's just you may be taking it a little far. But let me be clear in the way I answer this. The required clear floor space for a door must be kept clear, and especially as something that's fixed on the wall, you can't intrude into that area. So if you've got a paper towel dispenser or anything else that's mounted to the wall and hangs into that, imaginary box that goes all the way up to 80 inches off of the floor and 18 inches from the strike side, if you create an imaginary plane there, nothing is supposed to protrude into that plane. That's supposed to be kept clear. I think a lot of times it occurs and people either don't catch it or don't want to catch it. If it's considered to be something that they look at and go, that's not really an issue, people might let it slide. So that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Bill.
What else?
So there is no CAN 2-11B that in fact was in the 2019 CBC. So
Yeah.
does the prior version still apply to current code? That's a great question.
Yes, so that's, I wouldn't say it's a sore spot with me, but it's, I attend a lot of meetings with OSHPD staff. I'm on one of the Hospital Building Safety Board committees. I keep asking this question repeatedly. When are you guys going to issue the new CAN 2-11B for the 2019 code? And the reason is, OSHPD, they're human just like the next guy. They've only got so many hours in the day and they're trying to get a lot of stuff done and they haven't yet. They in fact went through the entire 2016 code cycle and never did issue CAN 2-11B for that code cycle. And now we're into the 2019 code cycle. So what they typically do, they honor the language in the 2013 code. It gives guidance. I'm anxiously awaiting when they issue it for a couple of reasons. There's a place where OSHPD has changed their interpretation. So what they actually enforce right now is not what the CAN says, the 2013 CAN. In particular, we'll get into it in the afternoon, but it's the lavatory versus sink knee and toe space requirements for a hand washing fixture. They, for years and years, have applied, well, not for years and years, but for, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 years, they've been applying the sink standards for a hand washing fixture. They've changed course, and I'm very glad about that. They're now applying the lavatory requirements for knee and toe space at a hand washing fixture. I think it makes a lot more sense. That's not in, there isn't a 2019 version of this that says that, so I'm anxiously awaiting the publication of that. I've talked to their staff about it. They're trying their best to get to it. Best guess of when it would be actually issued is a wild guess, anywhere from sometime over the next month to possibly several months from now. We don't really know for sure. Again, it has to go through several, all of their interpretive documents have to go through quite a rigorous vetting to make sure they haven't overstepped their boundaries. So long answer to a short question. I hope we got to what the question was. What else?
I think you did. You're actively asking OSHPD through your role as a committee member to address the need to update the CAN.
Yes.
Okay, this construction tolerance is a common question, and I think it was well worded by Mike. So he's, with the 12-inch on the push side as an example, or 18-inch on the pull side, is there an allowable tolerance, such as 1/8 of an inch? So if you don't fully meet those clear 12-inch and 18-inch dimensions.
Wow, yeah, the construction tolerance discussion, literally, I think Jim Terry has a whole seminar dedicated to this one topic. It's complex. I think in practical sense, most people that I work with would apply a construction tolerance of sorts that we all recognize when we're measuring stuff. Our measuring tools are less than completely accurate. I'm going to stray a little bit in the response here. As it relates to toilet room stuff, you're dealing with lavatories and toilets. The nature of them is they're curved. So you find yourself with a tape measure and you're holding it and trying to look and hold your head in a perfect 90-degree alignment. Because if you move your head a little to the left or a little to the right, the reading on your tape measure is a little bit different. So we all build in a little bit of latitude that if it's a 1/16 of an inch off, I don't know of just about anybody that's going to call you on something. As it specifically relates to doors and door clearances, boy, I very, very rarely have run into that. It typically is something, the tolerance issue comes up frequently in exterior paving. It comes up in toilet room fixture placement. As it relates to the clearances required at a door, you'd have to argue that the wall framing and the sheetrock or tile on the wall should be held with some construction tolerance to it. And that's why we're supposed to have 18 inches, but we only have 17 3/4 inches. I guess you could pitch the argument. I would hope we don't have to. The last thing I'll say on that, as you're pitching the argument, you have to consider who's asking the question here. Are we confirming construction compliance from the perspective of building official or a CASP who is inspecting recently installed construction? Is this path of travel related? Is this a lawsuit? I think the answer may be different on those different scenarios. So I want to be careful. This is one thing, I don't want to give you a black and white answer. It's quite a topic.
Technically, though, Bill, the code official can enforce the required clearance because they're there to administer the code, correct?
Yeah, so if it was a building official, you always have your rights to appeal. So if you're dealing with a field inspector and they ding you because you're supposed to have 18 inches clear and you've only got 17 3/4 inches, and they're not going to budge, you could appeal it to their supervisor. You can pitch your construction tolerance argument. You may or may not prevail. If it comes to, would I personally worry about it? Say the building official went along with us. Should I worry that I'm now at risk to a lawsuit? I would say, heck no. Theoretically, it's possible, but your average judge, if you got down to having to argue this in front of a judge, somebody's going to have to explain that they weren't able to use the facility because they only had 17 3/4 inches. I don't think that passes the muster. My personal take on it is I wouldn't worry about non-compliance at that fine a level, at least in that kind of scenario.
Here's an easy one, Bill. Can an accessory like paper towel dispenser, hand dryer exceed 4-inch protrusion as long as it is out of the designated clearances?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so your paper towel and hand dryer, they're outside of the designated clearances. So the toilet room's obviously of adequate size, but one or both of those devices exceed the 4-inch protrusion.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so, oh, Lordy. Yeah, this is a topic that, again, many of us roll our eyes at. The world of accessibility, as you all know, it has 1,000 different opinions. Now, this kind of question has come up. I've asked this question on a national webinar that was put to the US Access Board. And in fact, kind of interestingly, I'm pretty sure it was Rex Pace who was delivering the national webinar from the US Access Board. And for those of you that may or may not be aware, the US Access Board, they're a federal agency whose job it is to write the ADA standards, and then they interpret the ADA standards. Different from the Department of Justice, who enforces the law. So when they give the seminar or webinar, they interpret it to what their intent is. So I asked this question, well, in a toilet room, come on, let's be reasonable. In a toilet room, I have a hard time worrying that somebody who is sight impaired is going to be moving along at a quick enough pace that they're going to bump into something and get injured. Do we really have to apply the protruding object requirement? And the answer came back, yes. Sorry, but the answer is yes. It's a protruding object if it extends beyond 4 inches and there's not a cane detectable element underneath it. So, strange scenario at times where you look at the lavatory that hangs off of the wall and you look at the height requirements by code. If you're approaching it head on, you're going to go, well, it's up at 29 inches. That's not cane detectable. Isn't that a problem? And so most of the people that are in our industry, they're pretty careful about going crazy with the protruding object requirements. I will say this to round out the discussion. We've had this topic come up with our brain trust, and some of the wiser, more learned folks in our brain trust have said, well, you have to look at it differently depending on your toilet room layout. If you've got a multi-user toilet room and you may have maybe 8 different toilet stalls and a long run that goes from left to right, if you've got something protruding out 5 inches, that is a case where it's pretty legit. Somebody will be coming alongside and could whack their shoulder or their head right into it. May be very different from over worrying a soap dispenser in a tiny toilet room that you can't even imagine a scenario where they would approach it from the side. So people, we try to use those code requirements in a logical, judicious way. Not everybody does that though. So what else?
All right. Do the sink and countertop in a diagnostic or in diagnostic imaging rooms need to be accessible? Oftentimes the sink and the countertop are mainly used by staff.
Yeah, so we'll get into this in the afternoon, but short answer is yes. I want to explain. There's a difference between a hand washing fixture and a lavatory and a sink. So in our example, if the sink is for washing endoscopes or something along those lines, it's actually the employee's work duty. They go to the sink and they wash this thing out, and they may spend 10 minutes there. We could say that's a workstation, and you may argue that it either should or shouldn't meet accessibility requirements, but it's clearly a sink. It's not a lavatory. It's for washing a object. Either way, OSHPOD's going to say it has to meet accessibility requirements, either as a hand washing fixture or as a sink. It needs to be made accessible. I don't think there's a scenario I can think of where they're going to say, yeah, you don't have to make it accessible. So all those old facilities with foot pedals, when you do a remodel, you frequently get into needing to update those. Next question.
More on protruding objects.
Oh, goody.
The electrical health records computer keyboard wall-mounted pieces usually protrude, but we do them anyways. Any thoughts on that, Bill?
Yeah. So when I first came to Sutter about 6 years ago, we had so many discussions about this. So I've gone to my brain trust of access specialists, and we've talked about this one. We've come to a consensus of sorts that there's some judgment calls involved. I've seen these that are truly a problem. So your garden variety example might be You open the door to a room, an exam room or a treatment room, and right there on the wall, there is a electronic health records attached to a bracket with an articulating arm on it. And they tell us, oh yeah, no, we can push that up against a wall. It folds up. Here, let me show you. The truth is, nobody ever folds it up against the wall. Nobody does that. You never walk into a room cold and find it's all folded up nicely. So we assume it's going to be in its extended location. If it's in fact right there at the doorway, right there as you enter, every last one of our people are going to say, that's not okay. It is a protruding object. And it's actually going to encourage somebody sitting on a stool to sit right there in the doorway. Not good. So what we try to do is encourage designs, and we'll get into this in the afternoon as we talk about actual layouts. We want to encourage placement of those more or less in the back of the room so that they're not in the path of travel, they're not in the accessible route. In that context, most of our people are willing to say, okay, then I'm not going to worry about it. It could be considered a protruding object, but it does fold up nicely against the wall. And since it's on the back wall, we're going to not worry about it. We're not going to call them on it. But it has a judgment call based on the room layout. So as we do all of our projects, our access specialists do an independent plan review, independent from the building department. And our folks will put a professional, good judgment eye on this and make the judgment call. Is this really a problem or is it really not a problem? That's the best that we can do to make sense of that one. What do you think, Bill? Is that making sense to you? I know you've got, as a planner, an issue where the placement of those is an important thing. When a staff comes in the room, you want them to be able to log in, blah, blah, blah. So what is your take?
Yeah, from a workflow standpoint, if we can get it out of the accessible path, but I think as you get into the examples this afternoon, we can get to talking about workflow and the relationship of where that goes relative to usually hand wash fixtures and where the patient or the visitor chair goes. I think there's some really interesting dialogue that will occur around those three subjects. There is a follow-on question though. It's and here's how it's protruding objects are limited where they protrude into circulation path, in quotes. The definition for circulation path does not include rooms.
Yeah, so we're going to go into that in detail in the afternoon. I can tell the person who's asking the question understands this in a pretty good level of detail. It all revolves around identifying what a circulation path is and defining it. That too is a bit subjective. Without previewing the afternoon material too much, I'll say this, that by necessity, we have to manage that in a careful way. And at times we're going to be quote unquote cute about how we do that because the results end up at times ridiculous. And I think we have to always keep an eye, how ridiculous are we getting here? So other than that, I'm going to have to ask you to wait for that part of the discussion in the afternoon. What else have we got?
All right, we have there's 16 open questions, everyone. We're working through them. Do you need 3 feet clear all the around the CT? So I think what they're asking is, do you need 3 feet clear around the CT and MRI and a linear accelerator? So I think they're asking all the way around those devices.
So as an accessibility thing, no. Now, I think you're getting into the 1224 sections of code where OSHPD, quote unquote, says you have to have a 36-inch clearance around the medical equipment. That's a different thing. So you're required to have a 36-inch clearance. That's really for medical staff. The accessibility piece of that, we're going to cover that in the afternoon session. That may answer it more readily. What else?
It helps. Let's see here. If you have ADA restrooms in the EDS department for hand washing in the same room as work duty sink for washing equipment, does the sink need to be ADA? So I think it goes back to that question of in those departments where you have a hand washing fixture in addition to a work sink, do both need to be ADA?
Yes, they both need to be accessible, but there's different standards that apply. One of them is classified as a sink and the other is classified as a lavatory. Both of them need to be made accessible.
Okay. Here's a good one. Do non-occupied spaces in a hospital have minimum clearance dimensions? So there are clearance dimensions in occupied spaces, but how about in the non-occupied spaces?
I'm not sure how to answer that. In a non-occupied space, not sure what that would be.
So like a
non-occupied
janitor's
space.
closet is, I do not believe considered an occupied space.
Yeah, so the requirements, this is one of those things, again, I think building officials, I mean, not everybody specializes in accessibility. And so I cut building officials a lot of slack. Sometimes they just don't know. So sometimes there is an over-interpretation. As I said earlier, there's an assumption you have to have a turning circle in every room. The code doesn't say that. What the code will say is you have to have clearance requirements for a door. So we've run into this, again, with our brain trust on a janitor closet. So the way we've reasoned through it, when we realize fully we may not actually want to do it this way. We don't necessarily recommend people design this way, but if you break it down from an access standpoint, you could say, I have an obligation on the outside of the janitor's closet to have maneuvering clearances as required for doors. But when I open that door and go inside, I'm not required to have a turning circle and I'm not required to have clearance requirements on the inside for the door. I don't think anybody would really want to do that, but that's the way we would break it down. So as it gets to the question that was asked, how do you handle non-occupied spaces? You have to be careful about, consciously classifying each area. Is this for public use? Is this for staff use only? What's the requirement for doors, et cetera, et cetera? You're not required to make everything accessible everywhere in a building. What else?
I'm not clear on this one, but would Remodel CAN 2-106 apply to the toilet room change in accessibility?
Toilet room change. Can you say that again? I assume the CAN 106 is Remodel CAN? I know it's shocking. I didn't memorize all of the CAN numbers.
Let's go back in your slide deck. I think you talked to 2-106.
I don't think I did.
No,
That's the
okay.
Remodel CAN. So assuming it's the Remodel CAN, could you restate the question again?
Yeah, it's the remodel can. Would remodel can 2-106 apply to the toilet room change in accessibility? I'm not clear on that one.
Yeah, so let me just explain. Um, I'm not exactly sure what the person asking the question is really asking, but let me answer it this way. The remodel can ought to be your starting point when you do remodel projects. The remodel can, as it's written, kind of hands-off accessibility. It's not covered in the remodel can. There's sort of an oblique reference to accessibility being handled outside of the can. It's important, though, that you go to the can and you define the scope of your project. This is an issue that we come up with all the time. And frankly, we run into OSHPD plan check staff that stray out of bounds from time to time in this arena. The classic situation is if we're remodeling one piece of a radiology unit, we're going to want to say we're remodeling X-ray room 1 and X-ray room 2, and then there's a dressing room over there. We're not touching it. And the path of travel doesn't say anything about dressing rooms and accessibility. And yet we've got an OSHPD plan checker that may be saying, oh, you have to make the dressing room compliant. The code doesn't actually say that. Now, I'm not arguing for less accessibility here. I'm just saying the code doesn't take you there. Sometimes the code officials will say, well, you need to provide all the pieces and parts that are in a radiology unit per current code. And again, you go to that CAN 2-106, that's not what it says. You can follow the flow chart for the architectural flow, and it will not take you in a moderate sized remodel to a box that says you shall provide all of the pieces and parts of a remodel project, of a radiology unit. So getting to the bathroom part, in most context, that's going to be path of travel obligation. If you're remodeling something like an X-ray room, do you or don't you have to do a toilet room and bring it to current code? Yes, if it's designated as serving the area of alteration like we talked about earlier. If it's just a toilet room that happens to be near your project and it's not serving the area, you don't have to do anything.
So Bill, as follow-up, it's safe to say that you should be using CAN 2-106 on your acute care projects to help define your scope of work, what you're required to do. And if, as part of that scope of work, you've crossed both either the threshold and dollar amount or otherwise, you would then go to your path of travel obligations.
Yes.
And sort of in that order. Okay.
So I notice we've got 15 minutes before we start back up. I want to take 10 minutes more, and then I need a little 5-minute bio break. So we'll take 10 minutes more of questions, and then we got to call it off. So what else have we got?
I think we could take a break at this point. There still are 13 open questions, but several of which will be addressed in the afternoon. There is one though. During remodel construction periods, meaning during the course of construction, and you're altering an accessible public or staff toilet, what latitude is there to provide the services when the existing is in construction?
Oh, great question. And this is the real world. By the book, very, very little. When you do a remodel project, and I don't know, I could put my finger on a code section that says so. I'm sure it's out there, but I can't cite it. But you have to provide access as part of your project. You have to provide access as a legal obligation in your building. So if you were to say, well, here's what's happening for a short duration of time, I don't know what's a good example. The entrance to our building, say we're doing a remodel project at the entrance to our hospital. And so we're not going to be able to use the entrance for maybe a 3-week period of time. And we're going to reroute people into a door then to the side. And gee, that sidewalk has slopes that are non-compliant. Can we do that? Well, technically, no. I mean, technically, you're supposed to provide access as a function of your project. I think in the real world, OSHPD or any building department's at a disadvantage to identify that when it's all on paper. So there's also an avenue to argue for a very limited time. You know, what if it's 1 day? What if it's 3 hours? You know, at a certain point in there, you get, yeah, it's going to be okay if you shut it down for X number of hours or a few days. It's not going to be okay if this becomes weeks or months. And to what extent are you going to maintain absolute compliance? If it's in the hands of a lawyer or a building official, the answer is going to be absolute compliance. That's your obligation. In practical terms, you probably wouldn't run into any issues if your sidewalk cross slope was 3%. Nobody's going to care, probably. That's the best I could answer that one. So what do you think, Bill? 1 or 2 more questions?
I think we can take a break at this point.
Okay, then I'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. And I'm going to try to put off, so I'm going to go on mute here.